The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
He changed his name legally, I think in 1998, to .com guy at the height of the .com phenomenon. And he did it in order to stay in his room for the whole year with webcams on him and respond to people who wanted to know, what's .com guy doing today? And that's how his legal name. How about Karen Bosnick? Anybody know who Karen Bosnick is? She's a New Yorker. Karen Bosnick, among other things, loves good clothing. She loves Prada. And she loves it so much she got into a great deal of debt. Now you remember, you're a good resource. She got into about $10,000 of credit card debt. So she went on the web and essentially created her own blog and said, help me out. I need money. And not only did she get her whole debt paid off, but she turned a profit. How about Catherine Eaglestar? Anybody know who Catherine Eaglestar is? There's no reason why you should. Catherine Eaglestar doesn't exist. But Catherine Eaglestar is a customer service representative on the web, an animated bot, kind of a robot, for companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers. And what that implies, among other things, is that Catherine can understand your language, understand the context of your language, and can respond. And in fact, AT&T has developed a character, I forget what his name is, like Ted the Talker or something, which is being used on a number of websites that does voice synthesis and voice recognition so that when you call up a customer service center or whatever, Ted responds and guides you through whatever the script is. So I started to think, well, geez, an awful lot of coincidence, in a sense, this combination of media and reality. What does it mean? And it started to occur to me that it meant something transformative was happening, something really big. And it's almost neatly, and it's rare that this happens in history, but it's almost neatly broken down between past, that is before, and future. So there's almost a neat line in history, and we're living right in the middle of it right now. And the before is 5,000 years of human history that are associated with people being in places and people being with each other. You know, 400 years ago, I would have been Fred of Warwick. You know, I might be Frederick's son. And people would associate me with where I came from, who I came from, and that sort of thing. But it was all the social institutions happened, and to a large degree still happen, based on common grounds. So we built our schools so that people could come together in a common place. We even do our wars on common ground. I'll talk about that later. But the notion of going to a battlefield to do war is in some ways a very arcane phenomenon. It's becoming increasingly arcane. And that's interesting in its own right. The after, if you think of people and places, the before, the after is really information about people, about places, and virtual spaces. That is, it's kind of vague. And the common thread that runs between this before and after, this epic of history before and after, are people. So we've got people trying to straddle two kinds of realities. And it struck me that if this continued to go on, and it is continuing to go on, that it was going to lead to something very momentous. And I would make the statement at this point that from my perspective, human nature, human society are under the greatest assault in history. Unprecedented, unique, because of a series of things that are happening right now. And that unprecedented assault is something that I call the anonymous society. Now, what does it mean to be anonymous in this society? There are 280 million people. It seems sort of weird. Maybe it's the term itself. Different people have associations with the word anonymous. Well, for one thing, being anonymous means, among other things, that there is more than one of you. How many people here have a credit card? How many use email? And on and on and on. You have smart cards, you use email, you do instant messaging, you have pins, maybe you play role-playing games online. There are any number of aspects of you out there, and those are aspects in information. They're not really you. In fact, you may not even think of them as being you. But there is a composite you that's being formed daily. It gets bigger and bigger, unlike, hopefully, all of us who are on diets and trying to keep our weight in line and whatnot. This is getting much larger by the day. And that composite you is the part of you that the world knows even more than the physical you. You are known to most of the world by your digital self, by the information trails that you leave behind. In fact, you can think of it in terms of people are increasingly becoming digital selves and corporeal selves. And you may or may not have full control over that. You may not know how that information is used. You may not know who's looking at it. You may not know who's appropriating it in the case of identity theft. But it's there. And it's sort of digital ghost that exists apart from you and will probably survive you. Information about you will survive who you actually are on this planet. And there are some real interesting implications when you think about the fact that, particularly along generational lines, there are going to be increasingly generations of people who don't remember that it was ever any different. Until 40, 50 years ago, the amount of information that you accumulated in your life was relatively trivial. For the most part, you went to work, you came home, you visited people, and you were known to a large degree by who you were in society. From here on out and forevermore, you will be known more by your information. Now, if I'm if I'm a 70-year-old person, I may look at that one way, and if I'm a 7-year-old person, I'm going to look at it an entirely different way. Just as a sort of test of that theory, let me ask a couple of simple questions. How many people here remember getting their families, getting their very first telephone? Okay, well, it's hard to say, but you're among the youngest people who can remember that. So maybe there's a rural issue in here. It's hard to say. There you go, a rural issue. There are cultural issues here, but for the most part, I can say with some confidence that if you can remember your family's getting your first telephone, you're not 7 years old. Unless you live in Africa. Then it's possible. How many people remember getting their first television? A lot more. And I would have to put my hand up there. I think that's more my generation. I remember the little 8-inch box. It was very, it was massive, and it was very mysterious. And that's part of the point here. Up until, 40, 50 years ago, about the time I was starting to grow up, technology was mysterious. It was arcane. It was not part of your daily life, in a sense. It came into your life in the form of an object. It was Tom Swift. Remember the 1939 World's Fair posters, if you've ever seen them? The future was far away. It was chrome and steel. It was cars riding on magic highways that were way up in the sky and Tom Corbett's spaceships coming in. That's what people thought the future was. And actually, they thought that future was 2001. Remember 2001, A Space Odyssey? They had a fairly warped idea of what the future was going to be. But it was, gizmos, and it was mad scientists, and it was something out there. People now who have grown up recently don't think of technology that way anymore. How many people can remember getting their first PlayStation here? I'm expecting a couple of hands to go up right over. Thank you very much, boys. Oh, we had a couple over here, too. This would be the younger segment of the audience. That segment of the audience, among other things, has never known a time when there wasn't technology in their lives, when there wasn't media in their lives. And so we have, among other things, a generational issue. And I'm going to make the case from this point on that, and we'll talk about human nature, but apart from human nature to a certain degree, just the use, the immersion in this soup of technology and media is going to change people. It's going to change the way they interact with each other. It's going to change the way they communicate, the way they share information and even emotions with other people. And in the process, institutions will change. That is, all the rest of society, because I believe that basically we are a society of one. As individuals change through emergence, one person changes 2, changes 4, changes 8, and so on and so on and so on, to whatever the limiting factor is of that change. But eventually you're going to have a significant percentage of this society, this anonymous society, that will not remember a time when a school required a schoolyard and a classroom and an auditorium, is not going to remember a time when you had to go downtown to go to the store. We're probably halfway there already. By the way, these pages I'm turning, I think the technical term for what this is my wubby. For those of you who know that term, a wubby is like a security blanket. If there's a before and an after, if you buy into the notion that we are going through some sort of change, I think the next question, at least the next question that I came to was, well, why now? What has changed now? It's not like there hasn't always been technology. And the answer that I came to was probably the second big idea that I think I've introduced into this book. It was certainly the second one that hit me after the idea that institutions can be sort of metaphorical. And it is that the combination of technology and media that exists today and is proliferating and getting more diverse, more ubiquitous, more present in our lives every day has no precedent in history. And it isn't that individual technologies have no precedent in history. It's that there is something else going on. There is a convergence of media and technology. They are joining together to create combinational effects that have never existed before. So I invented a word for the purpose of this book, which I call mediology, combination of media and technology. I'm going to read the by-the-book definition for you, and then I'll try to explain it in terms that actually will make sense. Mediology is the convergence of a complex web of media and technology that enables realistic, synthetic alternatives to direct physical relationships and experience. Combined with human behavior, and that's an important part, it is a pervasive, expanding, and increasingly real environment that complements and competes with the physical world for our time and attention. So there's a bunch in there. First of all, what's implied there is that the combination of media and technology that we are starting to experience now, and let's understand that we are in the infancy of the ability of media and technology to create real human experiences. So it's only going to get better at doing that. But we are at the beginning of that process. It has never been like that before. The media and technology that existed before, particularly the stuff that transmitted information, was pretty much one way. It was bidirectional only to the degree that you sent a message and got a message back. So movies, television, radio were broadcast to you, and you're passive. You sit there and you watch them. Telephones, you listen, you talk back. You listen, you talk back unless you're rude. Telegraphs, the same kind of thing. And all of this, by the way, happening within about the last 100 years. 50 years from now, children will grow up with holographic wall projections that project avatars or bots or agents, software-generated characters who will be of their own design or someone else's design, who will seem perfectly realistic, who will be able to talk with them, who will be able to teach them, who will be able to be their friends in a sense. And that's a different kind of experience. It's interactive, and that's a critical part of mediology, is its interactivity. Because without that interactivity, it doesn't seem like a real experience. It doesn't seem human. And that's the point of a lot of these combinations, is that they increasingly start to mimic what we would expect to have in a human contact or a human relationship. And then the question starts to be, well, are we going to use them? You know, are we going to actually start to interact with mediology and accept it? And about, 5 years ago, I was working at Gartner, and it was kind of the dawn of the call center, the automated call center, you know, where you call up and get a voice on the phone, hello, what would you like? You know, that's about the state of the technology at that point. And I was talking to a CIO, Chief Information Officer, and he said, well, do you think that these are ever going to replace real people? You know, I said, well, you know, it's just a matter of like probably 2 years. I mean, at that point, as soon as they can start to talk in a more natural way, and as soon as they have a rudimentary ability to understand what you're saying and guide you through a fairly routine conversation. Well, right now I use Merck Medco as my medical provider to, you know, to get drugs and things like that. Where were they in the 60s? And the whole transaction is so natural and so easy. You call up, a natural sounding voice answers you. They ask you to say what your RX number is and to say your name. It understands what you say. It guides you through a little script. And in 5 minutes, you've done whatever you have to do. It's actually, frankly, better than dealing with most customer service reps. So in the span of 5 years, we've gotten from the dawn of call centers to one that's actually pretty usable. Imagine what's going to happen in 15 to 20 years. One of the things about technology in general, and this is an important thing to understand as you start to think about what mediology is capable of and what it will be capable of, is that all technologies abstract some kind of experience, some kind of direct physical experience. The chairs you're sitting on prevent you from falling through to the floor. 1,000, 2,000 years ago, you'd be sitting cross-legged on the floor, or pillows would have been brought in, but we'd be much closer to the ground, and I'd probably be kneeling and doing that sort of thing. You get a water glass that prevents you from having to, or enables you not to have to scoop up the water and drink it as you would have had to 5,000 years ago. These are sort of trivial applications of technology abstracting what would otherwise be a direct physical experience with our environment and with the world and with each other. The interesting thing about mediology, among other things, is that what it abstracts is emotional experiences. So it creates a barrier. And a number of interesting things happen as a function of its doing that. One of the interesting dichotomies in general about mediology is that it appears to connect you with other people at the same time that it isolates you from them. And this is true in almost every application of it. So when we talk, for example, about the internet being a community, when we talk about, among other things, there was a report, and I'll refer to it a little bit later, by the Pew Institute, and maybe that's a commentary on their report, that as a function of using the internet, women particularly had more of a social life. They did more social activity. Except that when you read the report, you find out that what they're talking about is that they email an instant message more. So what they're actually doing is going online more. Now, whether that is more of a social life, I think is one of the issues that you want to deal with when you're thinking about the future. Is it in fact a social life if you can live your life entirely absent from other people? And that capability is pretty much here right now. .com guy. You can sequester yourself. You can go to work. You can have friends, you can have cyber sex, you can order food in, you can do whatever you want and never see another human being. This is possible. There's one other thing about mediology that will pretty much drive, I think, the rest of this presentation. It would be nothing unless we used it. Technology in and of itself, as I used to say, a Gartner is useless. You know, you talk to technologists and they tend to exalt the technology. And you see that in current history. You know, remember 5, 6 years ago, the internet was everything. The internet was the huge event that was going to transform society. Now, what is it now? It's not the internet so much anymore, it's wireless technology. Suddenly cell phones and wireless technology. It's a new book that came out last year. I think it's Howard Rheingold, who wrote a book called Smart Mobs. And the notion there is that in one country particularly, I think it was, I want to say Indonesia, people using cell phones were able to bring down the government by communicating in a sort of viral way with each other. That term viral has now entered the lexicon of how people communicate with each other, meaning that people who couldn't see each other were able to sort of somehow coordinate their activities. And he gives a number of anecdotes about how wireless mobs, that is, people who are able to communicate indirectly with each other, are able to then coordinate larger actions, larger social actions. But the point of mediology is not that it's the internet, and it's not that it's wireless. It's not any of those one things or any of those two things. The reason it's powerful is because it's a combination of all of those things. Mediology, for example, is what will make it possible for you to be walking along with your cell phone attached to your hip, which in 2 years will have to be GPS enabled. GPS enables means that it is going to be targetable on a global positioning basis, meaning that you will be locatable. Now, suppose that you have a smart card in your pocket that has Wi-Fi technology, meaning wireless, short-term wireless, and you walk by a store, and the store has a wireless connection as well, and happens to know, based on the information that it just pulled off your card, who you are, and the fact that you bought a sweater there last year. So the store dials the satellite, which dials your cell phone. You pick it up and says, do you realize that you're 20 feet away from buying a much better sweater than the one you bought last year. Well, all of that technology exists right now. You might have seen Minority Report with Tom Cruise, and it set this future 20 years and 50 years into the future. It exists right now. And one of the interesting things about it, and this gets back to the whole notion of information, is that it is fueled by information. This technology is fueled by information about you and your friends, about you and your family, and in combination can do things to you, for you, with you, against you, as the case may be, that would be impossible with any one of those technologies. So it isn't the internet, it isn't GPS, it isn't wireless, it's all of these things. Think about all of the devices that you may personally have that could conceivably talk to each other, that could conceivably interact with each other. Your cell phone, your telephone, your television. You're going to have interactive television at home, most likely within 3 years. There are 3 or 4 research houses that have projected that from basically a standing start, that is relatively zero users of interactive television in 2000, there will be 40 million households by 2004 that have interactive television. At that point, your home now becomes a locatable and informational, that is interactive location for everybody out there who has information about you. Mediology would not work if it wasn't for you. And that's an important point to remember, because we're going to get in a moment to the question of human nature. And to me, that's probably the most interesting aspect of looking at this whole thing. Because when we talk about an anonymous society, we're really talking about people. There are kind of 3 components to mediology that make it work. Individually, they don't mean a whole lot. They're fairly innocuous almost. One of them is realism, the ability to create a realistic experience. The second one is one I call reach, which means its ability to get to you, its ability to be pervasive. And the third one is desire. That is a combination of nature, mass marketing, and consumerism that will allow you or enable you or make you want to use it. So the first one, realism. How many people have heard of the game EverQuest? Again, probably the youthful part of the audience. One of the reasons I bring up EverQuest is because if you want to see where new technologies and some of these capabilities are coming from, one of the interesting places to look is in games. Because games, sex, gambling basically is where these things get introduced into society. And probably the most complex virtual reality and combinational kinds of phenomena are happening in the game area right now. I'll give you a couple of examples. EverQuest is a multiplayer role-playing game that has 500,000 users worldwide who play every month. Some people are actually addicted to it. There have been articles written about how to cure EverQuest addiction, meaning that people are giving up their lives in some cases to play the game. There were 2 cases that I'm aware of in 2001, for example. One where a young man committed suicide because his character had been killed, and so he took it literally, I guess, and decided to take himself out of the world as well. Another where a father killed his toddler son because the child was bothering him while he was trying to play his game. The Sims, created by Will Wright, is the most popular role-playing game in the history of gaming. It's a PC game. There are 22 million copies. And I mention these numbers not because I really care about statistics so much as because, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, there is a tipping point. Or as Everett Dirksen once said, when he was talking about the budget of the United States government and spending, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real numbers. There is going to be a tipping point where enough people are going to be engaged in these kinds of things where it's going to make a significant difference in the way people and society behaves. So 22 million is actually a pretty significant number. There are a lot of variations of The Sims, but one of the interesting things about the latest variation, The Sims Online, is that you create a character. You can buy and furnish your own house. You actually create the character to look like whoever you want to look like. So there is that transference of your desire into that. And much of what happens in The Sims is flirting. It's what you would expect. People flirting with each other, trying to hook up and whatever. And there are connections out to the so-called real world. In order to buy a house or to buy an apartment in The Sims, you need to have simoleons. This is sim money. And some people don't like to play the game long enough to generate simoleons. You can buy simoleons on eBay. People sell their extra simoleons on eBay, and then you can take those back to the game and play. There was a woman who played The Sims and was particularly good at counseling other people, sim people, with their problems, their dating problems and whatever. That's funny in itself, right? But the interesting thing about her was that she was so good at it that some of her clients found out what her real world email address was and started contacting her in the real world to get, to get advice on their so-called real lives. I had a friend back in the 1980s, before all of this stuff was going electronic, back when role-playing games were dice and boards and phone calls and teletypes. He had been a championship swimmer in high school, and by the time I knew him, he'd blossomed to about 280 pounds. He was on Camp Dirty, could not function in the so-called real world, but he had about 5 or 6 characters in these various games. There was a Star Wars game, there were a number of Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role-playing games, and we were rooming at a training center. I was in Motorola at the time, and he would tell me about his lives in this other world, these other worlds that he inhabited. And I would swear that he only really came alive when he was living those other lives. He had no real way to function other than working as a technician, which didn't involve people. But when he talked about these other lives and the people that he played with, that was his real life. That's when he would suddenly become the person he had been. Boy, there are so many. The Matrix, the movie, and the game. Because these days you can't sell a game without having the movie tie-ins and whatever. In the game, which you don't get Keanu Reeves, I guess he didn't sign away his rights, you get Jada Pinkett Smith playing a character, I forget her name. Does anybody know? Niobe. Yes, Niobe. When they modeled the character that you play, so remember, you are investing yourself into this character. You are manipulating the things that manipulate Niobe, that allow her to do things in this game. They were able to model 30 different running motions, running and walking motions. They call it a technique called mocap, motion capture, so that your character is capable of doing 30 different things in motion, which presumably invests the game with a good deal more reality. Contrast that, or compare it with, interestingly, if you're paying attention to the news in the last couple of weeks, that the CIA has contracted with a company out in California that claims to be able to target or identify people by the way they walk. So that's another form of mocap, and you start to have these kinds of connections where reality and unreality, if you like, depending on which words you'd like to apply to either side of the equation, start to blend and merge, and they become indeterminate. I think things like the reality shows, for example, have gone a long way in promoting that notion that not only are we a nation of voyeurs, but we are also the targets of the voyeurs. And so the distinction between being in the media and out of the media gets blurrier every day. There was supposed to be a game a few years ago developed by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck called The Runner, which would feature somebody running literally through society, the real society, but watched on television by millions of people who would then try to track this person, figure out from clues where they were going to be and get money if you could find them. Contrast that with a movie called The Game, which featured Michael Douglas and Sean Penn, where Michael Douglas entered a game in his real life where people would come up to him in the course of his day, or he'd get letters or phone calls or whatever, and he could never be sure if it was part of the game or not. Electronic Arts produced a game, and I don't think it's actually been, there might be litigation issues. They produced a game that was supposed to come out last year called Majestic. In that game, you would play online on a PC, but you would get phone calls, you would get emails, you would get people walking up to you potentially, and you would not know for sure if they were part of the game or not. These things have a way of getting really confusing. Reach. The ability of mediology to get to you. And remember that you are complicit. So this question of reach has a lot of components to it. It isn't just a function of the stuff that exists. That is, we all have cell phones. It isn't just a function of you want a cell phone. This culture is particularly adept at acquiring new things. So, and that's an important point, by the way. We'll get to that in the question of desire. But the fact that people acquire technologies as they come out has a lot to do with the speed with which mediology is penetrating the society and the ultimate crisis in the anonymous society, which is, are we going to have enough time to figure out what's going on before it's already gone on? For example, electricity, invented in 1873 from a practical perspective, took 46 years to get to 1/4 of the US population. Television it was invented in the early 20s, I didn't know that, took about 30 years. The web, the internet, invented in 1991, took 7 years to get to 1/4 of the US population. And cell phones have gone much faster than that. In 2000 to 2001 alone, there was a 38% jump in the number of people who had cell phones. It jumped from the 90 million to over 108 million, meaning that about 50% of the US population, and that's everybody, has a cell phone, which is pretty amazing. Some of the issues of reach are so intrinsically bound to the question of desire that it's difficult to separate them, but I'll try. The components are things like computers and networks and PCs and cell phones, of course, but it's also things like biometric devices. By biometric, I mean things like facial recognition, palm recognition, and whatever, because those things share information about yourself with the rest of the world. The London police force, for example, has cameras situated in certain critical areas in the city, and they have a database, again, the function of information about you, a database of people's faces, in this case, criminals' faces. And what they do is they constantly scan with these cameras, and they capture these faces, and then there is a program that compares the faces that they capture with their known database of criminals. Now imagine how fast this must be happening for it to be useful. So the power of this stuff is pretty amazing. And when they make a match, when they say, oh, there's a criminal at Knightsbridge who shouldn't be there, the police are dispatched to go get that person, to bring them in and find out whether they're casing a place or not. Biofeedback is another area. It takes a number of forms. My brother-in-law created this great doll a few years ago. Some of you may have purchased it for your kids. It's called Rosie, I think Ring Around the Rosie. And the cool thing about this doll, aside from the fact that it's kind of cute, is it has two little metal pads on its hands. And when you hold the hands, you connect the circuit. So there's a little battery inside, and you make the circuit, and as soon as you do, it starts singing, Ring Around the Rosie. You let go, it stops singing. IBM, a couple of years ago, said that they have now a technology where you put a smart card in your pocket, presumably connected to your body in some way, that is, wired to you or against your skin. And that smart card has information, well, it can have any kind of information, really. It could have information about who you are, your health, whatever. And when you shake someone's hand, that information passes to their smart card, their information passes to your smart card, and you can download it later and find out who the hell you just met. Well, I mean, but there are applications here, right? Because I could conceivably meet everybody in this room and know everything about you later on for mailings, for a salesperson, for a consultant. These might be invaluable applications. There was another biofeedback anecdote that I wanted to run, but I can't remember it, so I'm just going to move on. There is a new technology that's just being developed, and it's based on nanotechnology to a large degree. How many people have heard of the term MOTES? M-O-T-E-S. Probably because we've spoken. No? MOTES are very, very tiny sensor devices that have a little bit of intelligence in them. By intelligence, I mean they are wired to know how to do one little thing. Intel is developing a number of MOTES. They have applications. I mean, you can imagine all kinds of applications. They could, for example, be used to monitor radio activity in a place there where you wouldn't want a radioactive spill. They have talked about having MOTES for Alzheimer's patients, so that that person would transmit where they are, and presumably there will be more wireless presences around, and as that person walks around, you'll know where they are. Clearly, though, there are all kinds of opportunities to develop MOTES in your home, and in combination with smart appliances in your car, your home, in your life, to do things that are, if not more nefarious, certainly more intrusive. When you think about the reach of mediology, don't stop by thinking about the large things. It's really easy to think about your cell phone as being, well, if I turn my cell phone off, somehow I have disappeared in a sense. It's not going to work like that. At a minimum, there are going to be technologies that just monitor the fact that someone is there if they don't know for a fact that you're there. There are going to be biometric sensors that measure heat, measure presence, measure movement, and they're going to be embedded in a lot of places in society that are going to feed, again, information back into one place. So the question of reach is, it's not only a function of the technology itself, but it's a function also of habit, use, and desire. And that really brings me, I think, to the big question, the one that I grapple with in terms of where to go with my wild speculations about the possibilities of the anonymous society, and that is the question of human nature and desire. I ask you for a moment just to think about what connotations you have when you hear the term human nature. What does it mean to you, when someone says human nature? One of the interesting things I've discovered in doing my research for the book is that there are lots and lots of opinions about what human nature might or might not be, and how mutable it is, how changeable it is, how permanent it is. Probably the most authoritative resource right now, and he's spoken here at the Y as well, is Steven Pinker. He is kind of the guru of human nature, and his perspective is that human nature has some universal qualities. That is, that all cultures, all people have some genetic, biologically based ways of being. And I think that's an interesting perspective. Let me read a quotation by Steven Pinker. Humans are a social species with intense longing for friends, communities, family, and spouses, consummated by face-to-face contact. Email and e-commerce will continue their inroads, of course, but not to the point of making us permanent antisocial shut-ins. Only to the point where the increase in convenience is outweighed by a decrease in the pleasure of being with friends, relations, and interesting strangers. So, Steven Pinker comes down on the side that we are going to have some sort of automatic controls. Even if I am 100% right, yes, there is mediology. Mediology is unprecedented, it's unique, it's an assault on our senses of ourself, not just on our senses, and it has the power to change our behavior. Steven Pinker's perspective would be, yes, but. At some point, human nature will revert. Human nature will force us out of our homes, out of our isolation, and back together. I think my first response to that idea would be, well, how would you know? If this is unprecedented, if this is in fact a unique experience, if for the very first time this combination of media and technology and human behavior are integrating to change behavior, why not make the case that, hey, we're adaptive beings, that we will adapt to the new reality. If you're on a desert island, you adapt to what life on a desert island. If you grow up in a world where you have an interface to do everything that 500 years ago you could have done with another person, some segment of society is going to use it. Now, the question doesn't become if, it becomes how much, and how much is acceptable. If 20% of society becomes essentially the Borg, you know, to use the Star Trek metaphor, the Borg, for those of you who are not familiar with Star Trek, are an alien race that are part man, part machine. They get assimilated. That is, they all kind of know what everyone else knows, and they have pieces of machines attached to them. Well, in a sense, metaphorically, that's what we're talking about here. One of the things that Steven Pinker refers to as a kind of compendium of human nature or human natural tendencies is some work done at MIT in 1991 where one of the people there, his name is O'Brien, I can't remember his first name, developed a list of over 200 traits that he says are common to all cultures. That is, you can go to New Guinea, you can go to France, you can go to Africa, you can come to Brooklyn, and you're going to find these kinds of common traits in people wherever you go. It's an interesting thing to parse that list, because one of the things that you notice is that aside from, I would say, 10 or 15, there aren't any others that are implicitly about physical contact and physical closeness. They're ambiguous at best. Let me give you an example. And these are the human universals. On the list is a belief in religion, but not on the list is praying together. On the list is baby talk, but not on the list is hugging and cuddling. Sexual attraction is on the list. Anyone want to care to guess what's not? And please don't get profane. Kissing. Kissing is not on the list. Affection, expressed and felt, is on the list. Holding hands is not. Customary greetings is on the list. A talking face-to-face is not. And you will not find, for the most part, analogs to any of those things that are not on the list. What you will find is an awful lot of things that can happen in your mind. And remember that, I mean, in fact, if you like, when we do the Q&A, if you're interested in, you know, challenge the speaker, come up with a profession, come up with any human activity that can't be done apart, and I will endeavor to prove that it can. So desire is also a function of habit. The commitments you make to doing things have a lot to do with what you see every day. You know, that the notion right at the beginning of, like, what's changed? You know, what's different about the future than the past is that we're creating replacements for things we do every day that are going to seem just as reasonable and just as realistic as the old habit, the old commitment to a thing. In fact, well, I mean, how many people use ATMs now? Who don't even bother to go to the bank anymore. So what's going to happen to banks? You know, I mean, these are sort of trivial things. There was a Stanford study, and I've debated whether to use this as an example because, well, I'll tell you why I've debated in a moment. There was a Stanford study in 2001 that looked at internet use and its social consequences. And what they found was that as internet use rose, and we already know that 60% of the US population is online, over 160 million people are online. As it rose beyond 5 hours a week, there was a consequent drop in doing other things. Now, my kid used to say when something was obvious, he'd say, "No duh, Dad." And I would argue on one level that, you know, if you have 24 hours in a day and you suddenly are doing something 5 hours a day that you didn't do before, something else has got to give. You're doing something else 5 hours less, maybe sleep. But in the Stanford study, they claimed that what they found was that people were spending less time with their families, and that they were spending less time in social situations. They're also spending less time watching television. This is reinforced somewhat by a book that came out a couple of years ago called Bowling Alone, which found that there is a significant drop in community activities in the United States. There's also, by the way, been a significant drop in reading newspapers, reading in general. And what that all adds up to, I think, is a drift by a significant population towards a certain type of media that doesn't demand personal contact and doesn't demand thinking critically in terms of words. One of the aspects of mediology that is tied into cell phones, the web, and whatever, is that it tends to be a more spatial, visual medium. And one of the consequences of living more in a spatial and visual medium is that you talk less. And as you talk less and think less in terms of words, we become a more nonverbal society. So reading less would be consistent with that. Newspaper subscribership going down would be consistent with that. Spending less time in community situations where you have to talk to other people, because that's how people socialize with each other. They talk and they think in terms of words, would be a consequence of that. And we can ponder what the implications are of going down that path. And this for me is the most fun, because it's the area where I have to be least accountable. You know, I can quote statistics, I can draw some conclusions, but in terms of trying to predict the future, we're all equal. I think certainly there are directions that get pointed to as a function of the nature of mediology and the way people use it. The first one and the most obvious is that it's going to continue to go. That is, there's going to be more convergence of media. It's going to become more personal. In fact, for those of you who may or may not be familiar with Moore's Law, the notion that technology gets cheaper and faster and smaller, by the way, over time. Every 18 months there's a new cycle. One of the secondary aspects of that is, as that technology gets smaller, it also gets more personal. It gets more attached to you. So your cell phone becoming more personally attached to you, these motes, these sensors, these smart cards, biofeedback devices. Increasingly, like the Borg, there will be technology that is attached closer to your body. And we can make, I think, a reasonable assertion that given how quickly mediology has developed in the last 15, 20 years, from the time that we could remember getting our first televisions and telephones to where we are now, that it's only going to accelerate, and that people will continue to use it. Another implication, and this is part of the nature of mediology, is that, and I mentioned this before, as people become more isolated, there's a consequence to that. If you buy into the idea that technology, particularly media, isolates you from its object, that is, puts a wall between you and it, or you and other people, then there's a consequence to more people using that kind of mediology. Now, what are those consequences? What are they likely to be? There's been a 30% rise in teen suicides in the last 15 years. There is a general increase in suicide in the United States, largely in the areas of young men and older people. Can I attribute that to mediology, the effect of mediology directly? I wouldn't even try. But I can say that if people, as a function of, what do you want to call it, modernity, as a function of a technological society, the Jacques Ellul term, as a function of being more isolated from other people, if they feel depressed, then you're going to see a rise in suicide. But you're also going to see a consequent rise in aggression. So the question, for example, that was tied to the Columbine killings a few years ago, that the two young men who went into Columbine High School and shot the school up had been avid Doom players, first-person shooter games, before they went in. May or may not be an apt connection, but there was a $5 billion lawsuit, class action lawsuit, brought against Sega and Nintendo and the other game makers as a function of other people's believing that there was, in fact, a connection. I think, in general, you're going to see, in fact, it would almost be an avatar or a way of confirming that mediology is taking hold in society, a great deal more nihilistic behavior, turned inward and turned outward, as people feel more disconnected from each other. Let me give you a slightly more arcane implication or speculation. I would make the case that all word-based institutions, social institutions, that is, ones that exist largely based on people talking to each other and talking between the institution and their constituency, are in great trouble. And those would be things like schools, governments, and churches, among others. I think it's no accident, for example, that Karl Rove, the media specialist, is one of the most powerful people in Washington right now. Because if you consider what the nature of mediology is and how it impacts, for example, a government, there are a couple of assumptions built into the way we govern. One is that we have an informed electorate who understand what's being said to them, can process that, and then process back to their elected officials what they think about it, and that this takes some time. That there is a process by which people think about what they're told and then regurgitate in the form of voting or in the form of lobbying or some sort of pressure on their elected officials. One of the things that mediology does, among other things, is it eliminates time and space. So you have a much more direct connection with the people who are voting. And so there is a role for someone like a Karl Rove to have his hand on the pulse of the electorate at all times. And this, as the immediacy of contact between the elected and the electorate gets more pronounced, and it can only become more pronounced, will become a more significant role in government. Now, what does that mean for the structure of government itself, which is a place-based institution in this country and in most countries? It's a place you go to. Well, we don't need places that you go to anymore. Washington really is a metaphor at this point. It doesn't have any actual meaning in terms of the needs of the government to function or the relationship of the electorate to that government. Increasingly, social institutions are going to become, in a sense, metaphorical. That is, they're going to become sort of tenuous. It's going to be hard to figure out exactly what they need to be, but they certainly don't need to be what they have been in the past. I'm not even sure that they can be sustained that way. Think about war, for example, just a simple example. In April or May of 2002, after we had invaded Afghanistan, we were hunting for Osama bin Laden, and one day, for scrap metal along with his friends, and they were just taking 5, unfortunately, in the wrong place and at the wrong time. The interesting thing about that is not so much that this person was mistaken for Osama bin Laden, though that is interesting in itself. He was targeted by satellite systems based on infrared sensing, based on a database of information about people who might look like Osama bin Laden. That is, characteristics that were matched by the database when this person's profile was input. And all of the targeting and kill decision was made essentially automatically, or if you like, anonymously. The decision to push the button was human. That was the only part of the decision that was human. And I think that's a really, really good metaphor for thinking about what's happening to all social institutions, because it is that removal. What is war if it isn't face-to-face, hand-to-hand, people shooting at each other? Something like terrorism as a form of war becomes inevitable, because what are people without that kind of weaponry going to do? How are they going to essentially espouse their position on the battlefield when, look what happened in Iraq? We took, what, 50 casualties as a result of enemy fire? The enemy took upwards of 10,000. Those kinds of imbalances are the norm now. If you have the technology, you win. If you have the mediology, the ability to integrate that technology with information, you win big. And so war has to go underground. That whole notion of viral in a social institution starts to become real. All social institutions, to a certain degree, either crumble or go underground or morph into something that adapts to this kind of reality. And the last question I'm going to ask in this presentation is, if all of this is so, and I think it is, obviously, or I wouldn't be here. Why hasn't anybody noticed? You know, where is the public discussion? Why are leaders not talking about this? Why aren't there a plethora of books about the nature of anonymity or the nature of the way these social institutions are changing? And I think the answer is a paradox. I think on the one hand, it's happening too quickly, and on the other hand, too slowly. It's happening too quickly, in a sense, for the reasons I already mentioned. You know, the last 50 years, basically, is the entire amount of time that we've run up to where we are right now. 1950 and before, going back to the dawn of history, people pretty much behaved the same way with each other. They pretty much socialized on common grounds. So it's too soon. But in a sense, it's also too slow. And what I mean by that is, all of these advances in technology and media happen one at a time. So it's really easy to say, oh, the internet, that changes everything. Well, no, it doesn't really change everything. So we put that in our back pocket. Oh, wireless. Oh, so we have smart mobs. Oh, that's going to change everything. And I guarantee in a couple of years, everybody will say, well, no, it's not really going to change everything. And so we'll put that in our back pocket. But meanwhile, they've accumulated. We now have wireless and the internet and GPS and all of the other things that are coming online. And this society particularly is very, very good at adapting to these new changes. We're mass consumers. We buy anything that gets sold. We don't think much about it. What we get is understanding ahead of use. So to finish, let me read a couple of what I think are really provocative quotations by a couple of other people, and then I'll give you my final thought on this. This one came from Candice Bergen, and you can hear her say this if you go to the Museum of Television and Radio at the end of their production of Great Moments in Television. Think about it. Where else but on television can so many of us go to be alone together? Stephen Johnson, who just wrote a great book called Emergence, said, in the future, our networks will be caressed by 1 million invisible hands, seeking patterns in the digital soup, looking for neighbors in a land where everyone is by definition a stranger. Charles Van Doren, and yes, for those of you who can remember, it is that Charles Van Doren. For those of you who can't, he was in a major scandal in the 1950s on a game show called 21, where after he amassed over $100,000, which was real money in those days, was found to have been handed the answers by the hosts because he was such an attractive guy they wanted to keep him on the show. If you saw the movie Game Show about 10 years ago with Ralph Fiennes, it was based on Charles Van Doren. But he went on to be the author of A History of Knowledge and to be the chief historian at the Encyclopedia Britannica. So he's a smart guy in his own right. No normal person can be alone. He needs relations. He needs a community. Now a person can be entirely alone facing a computer screen. He can ask it to present itself before him. He needs no one. Community is dying in this country. There has to be a catastrophe. I don't know what it will be, but it will be. And I thought I was pessimistic. Let me tell you what I think is happening. In the next 20 years, I think we're going to be resolving one really fundamental and critical question. And essentially the question is, what does it mean to be a human being? On one end, we continually find that animals share far more of our sensibilities than we ever thought. In fact, there was a funny report that came out about 2 years ago. I remember the headline said, scientists find dogs are smarter than they thought. And I was thinking that the dogs probably put out a report that said, you know, dogs find people are stupider than they thought, you know? But the whole notion that animals are sentient beings, that they're smart, that they feel, encroaches on our humanity at one end. We no longer have the mantle of being the, you know, okay, we've got opposable thumbs, great. But opposed to that, we're not hugely different in terms of our ability to feel from many animals. And at the other end, through mediology, through computers, through software, through our own efforts, we are investing in machines a lot of our so-called humanity. Robert Jastrow, who was the head of the Jet Propulsion Lab in Houston, wrote in an article in 1975 that we might be coming to the end of the carbon era and beginning the silicon era. And he wrote it as part of an article saying we're never going to make it to the stars. If we want to send people to the stars, we're going to have to create machines that have our sensibilities and our intelligence and our wit, and they can go to sleep for 1,000,000 years, wake up and say hi. Of course, when they get back, it'll be 2, 10, 50 million years later, and nobody's going to even know, where they're from and why they went in the first place, and they're going to seem really stupid anyway. But we are getting squeezed as people by animals, by sentient beings on one end, and by our own willful divestiture of our intelligence and our knowledge and our psyches on the other. And that transition is going to be an ongoing process. Does it mean that man and machine are combining? Does it mean that we're going to go to the Elysian field and spend the rest of our millennia, farming and writing poetry? These are questions. There are also significant questions about how we're going to maintain our sense of community, our sense of family, our sense of the social institutions that we care about while the world is changing around us and while we participate in that change. The one thing I know for sure is that if we don't do anything, by default, the end point is going to be an anonymous society. Thank you very much. Now, we didn't hand out cards, so I'm hoping that a few people said, what would he say if I asked him X? Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I'd like to maybe temper your pessimism. Tomorrow the Harry Potter book is released. It's a very old medium, which seems to have been embraced by many young people. New Year's Eve, a few people go to Times Square to take part in an arena, in a sense. July 4th, if the weather permitting, there's going to be more than a fair number of people at Joe's Beach. I'm wondering whether there still is a sense of community out there, something maybe you're overlooking in this mediology just complements or supplements our interaction, but doesn't replace it.
Yes, there's still a sense of community out there, and no, I don't think it complements it. I think it ultimately replaces it to a large degree. I would say on the one hand that yes, you can point to all, look, society hasn't transformed. My argument is not that it's transformed, it's that it is transforming. And so there are going to be artifacts of the past that are going to survive just because they are cherished artifacts, and I would attribute the gathering at New Year's Eve to being in that category. There are going to be people who read forever, and the question isn't a binary question. I don't believe that people are uniform in the sense, perhaps not in the Steven Pinker sense either, that you turn a switch and everybody becomes one way or another. I think the question is really one of degree. I said before, would it be acceptable? Let's try to figure out what the tipping point is. Would it be acceptable in the current context of society if 25% of the people in the world became essentially viscerally incapable of dealing with other people? If they just so prefer dealing with, remember that the interfaces are going to get better. They're going to get more natural, they're going to get more real, they're going to get smarter, they're going to get more personal, they're going to know who you are, they're going to be able to talk to you as who you are. They're going to have all kinds of information behind them that knows everything about you. So if that were the case, how much time would you spend with your digital friend as opposed to your corporeal friends? Now, how about the person sitting next to you? So we have shades of difference. I'm not saying that people will stop reading. I would be willing to bet, though, that if you had an ebook that dramatized the Harry Potter book, you would see people flock to it. Either reading it to them or bringing pictures up or video as the book was read, that a significant percentage of people would prefer that to sitting there with an 820-page book. I don't know if you remember this. This is quite an aside, but there used to be a show in the 1950s called Andy's Gang with Andy Devine, and he would start every show. He was a cowboy character. He started every show with this book that was this big, and it was his storybook. And it was, okay, kids, today, boom, you know, and then he would read the book. Well, I mean, that's the new Harry Potter book. I happened to look the other day. The first one had something like 300 pages. The second one had something like 4, then was 6, then it was 7 and change, and we're up to over 800. You know, either Rowling is getting more prolific, or she's just running out of things to say and, you know, just dragging it on and on and on. I don't know that that answers your question, but I think if, you know, I mean, I tried to be as emphatic as I could on my last point. If we do nothing, mediology is going to continue, regardless. It's going to get better at doing what it does. And my opinion is that more people will use it. Yeah?
Why is that a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing if, I mean, I just think that the idea of community sounds very idyllic and it's very subjective. The term community is very different for a lot of people, and a lot of people never experienced, I think, the kind of community that you're talking about. And if they can experience it in a virtual sense, why is that bad?
It may not be a bad thing.
You know, if,
Sorry.
are the people, does the technology fragment the people, or do the fragmented people flock to the technology because they're fragmented already, and that's where they can, you know, come alive or relate to people? I mean, there's always a section of people that don't relate to other people.
I think the answer is both. I think the fragmented people who have problems dealing with other people will flock to a medium, because it is about a medium and it isn't necessarily about the underlying technology. Will flock.
Medium is the message, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they'll flock to a medium that reinforces their ability to feel good, right? But there is another whole component to the social system that is made possible by mediology, that in a sense impels, not compels, but impels to flock to it just because it's there. You know, the ATM, the easy things to do. And part of the point here is that there is an additive, aggregate effect on who you are by spending that time with those interfaces that you would otherwise have done in another way. So there is a subtle current that goes underneath the sort of overt changes in the way people behave that over time is going to change the working of the entire society. And whether it's good or bad, you know, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's good. Personally, I'm a touchy-feely kind of guy. I like to talk to people. I like to see their faces. You know, I'm not a really sociable guy, but, you know, as some people here know. But I do think that anything that's lasted 5,000 years ought to get some, you know, ought to get a nod, ought to be thought about before we move into a whole nother realm where we're going to change regardless of whether we thought about changing or not, just because it's there.
Sure.
You know, we don't know what virtual reality is going to be like yet. Really good virtual reality. I mean, where, you know, the kind of virtual reality where you can take a vacation in your head anywhere you want to be and feel like you really were there. You know, the total recall thing. You know, when that happens, I don't see anybody coming outside, you know? I mean, it's like, I mean, hello? Well, I mean, maybe you will. And you'll go, where is everybody?
No, I'll be the first one to turn the computer.
Yeah, exactly. And we all will. And hopefully, but hopefully human nature will assert itself and we'll find some balance. But I don't know what that balance is going to be. And part of the point of this book is not that we're going into a different balance. Part of the point of the book is just, does it matter? You know, is it better or is it worse? Do we care? But before we get rid of it, because in a generation, it's gone. You know, those kids back there do not remember what I remember. You know, a world where I had to go out if I wanted amusement because there was nothing at home. You know, television shows in the middle of the afternoon were boring and there were only 3 channels. You know, I had to go do something else. They don't have to. And that's different. Better, worse, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say that I agree with you that we see it in our age group they're giving everything up, and they're just enthralled with it. And, you know, there's like no communication with these people.
Yeah, that's what happens. In the back.
Yeah, I'm interested in the political implications of what you're talking about. Because democracy is very much the place that's based upon individual decisions that people have to make. And yet, in describing this facelessness we have, this anonymity in society, what's the effect of so many years, decades now, where we're presented information based on what groups, classes believe and think. We have so much information based on collections of polls, interpretations by strangers who never meet the people who are giving them the information. And this is supposed to represent the opinion of the country or classes in the country. And yet we're getting further and further away from individuals making decisions. And I think that it has an effect on our concept of ourselves as citizens in this country, and could have a very major impact as to why the number of people actually voting is shrinking and shrinking each time. And in terms of the power that polls has in terms of enforcing this anonymity, I see a greater removal of the individual from an identification as a thinking citizen contributing to society.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there's a number of things you said that come into play. One is, well, just the media of the poll tends to homogenize people. You're either in that group, you're not in that group. You start to think in those terms. Certainly, I think there are a lot of reasons why voting has gone down, and that's a discussion for another day. But feeling isolated from the process would be one of them. Feeling that you are detached from the decision-making process, feeling that you don't have a voice. And that's part and parcel, not only with mediology, but just with the whole trend over the last 50, 60 years of politics getting away from the grassroots. In 1960, during the Kennedy-Nixon campaign, or maybe it was 59, because I guess the election was in the beginning of 60, I lived in Brooklyn, New York, in Flatbush. John Kennedy came to our neighborhood on the back of a convertible. There was one guy in the front driving, and he pulled up to our corner and stood up in the back of the convertible and said, "I want your vote." I can't do, that sounded too Jewish, didn't it? I can't do John Kennedy. I think we're clear about that. And by the way, we've been working on our Boston accent, but I don't know how to say the O's. I know pack the car, but I can't say "I want your vote." That's not going to happen anymore. I mean, politicians are somewhere out there. It's more like in the Woody Allen movie Sleeper, the guy with the nose. It's like. It's somebody you see on a screen. So that's part of it. One of the things that I find really interesting, though, and it's I think one that gets short shrift or not much attention, is the way mediology changes the nature of the discussion. How should I put this? The political process assumes a form of engagement. And we are in the process of transitioning, I think, from engagement being personal and physical, grassroots, individual, to being online in a sense. So you monitor and you interact with the political process through a medium, through an intermediate. And one of the things that's going to do is isolate that individual. It's going to make it harder for that person to advocate their position to the broader masses. It would appear, I think, otherwise. It would appear that you could get on the internet and lobby personally. But one of the interesting things about the internet in general is that you don't know if anyone's out there. It's not like sitting in a sense, let's think of this as a political meeting. We are an anachronism. People coming to a building, You know, I mean, how arcane, you know? Coming to a building to listen to a human being talk, the internet doesn't support that kind of behavior, because there would be no way for me to know that there was anybody at the other end of the line, and that if I got a response that that was actually a human being responding, and that will be increasingly true. And what that essentially does, I think, is disenfranchise humans from the process. And that's why I said before, I think all word-based institutions are in real trouble. I don't think our democracy, I don't think this form of government can survive. Yeah.
I'm most intrigued by your evolution of the use of words becoming less so. So here's sort of a hypothesis, you know, way back in the beginning, humans grunted, right? Or almost whatever they were.
I did anyway.
And they formed words and developed language and grammar and a written language. And the written language you could use to create new kinds of abstractions and concepts and algebra and history and science. And now you're suggesting, in effect, we're going to go backwards, away from words, away from symbolism, back to visual, spatial. We used to be hunters, now we're going back to the spatial, the visual, the sensible, even if it's virtual, but away from words, away from abstraction. So maybe that's going to lead to, if that's true, we're going to revert from words and abstractions because we have this real life to deal with. Maybe that leads to a split society. The wisdom, the scientists, the professors who are still abstracting, and the rest of the masses who deal with, you know, the emotional spatial world and leave the scientists somebody else.
That's so Orwellian, you know. Let's call them the proles.
And is that
I think there's an issue in.
there's no motivation, right?
There's an issue in that at least I would take an issue with it. There are probably many, because I saw you going like this as well. But one of them is that apart from whatever discussion we might have about how spatial that world was, since we weren't there, we don't really know. Those people were in the same cave together. They were physically tied together as a family and a community and whatever, and it was a physical life. They may not have been verbal in the sense that they could communicate ideas or complex ideas linguistically, but they were certainly in each other's presence. It is a far different thing, I think, to try to evince that kind of behavior in cyberspace, you know, for want of a better word. One of the loneliest, I think, for me anyway, one of the loneliest philosophical statements ever made was, "I think, therefore I am." You know, what does that mean? It means in part that I'm, you know, as the old joke used to go, I trust you and me and I'm not so sure about you. I don't remember it in the list of human universals, but I would be willing to bet that it's a human universal, that every person at some point in their life wonders if everything around them is a sort of fantasy. That if what you see is real in any sense at all.
From the Matrix.
Oh, the Matrix, okay, there I go. I knew I had to be quoting some mass media somewhere along the way.
This is the
And
Matrix.
yes, this could be the Matrix. But we go through epics trying to resolve essentially that question, right? We try to figure out what a society is. What does it mean to be social? How do we develop a civilization in the context of living with other people, setting up roles for them and whatever? How is that going to change when the roles that are, for example, fulfilled by the grocer are fulfilled by Peapod, and the roles that are fulfilled by the judge or the educator or the politician are fulfilled by an image on the screen? It's not the same thing as the cave life. It's different. Yeah.
I teach in Yonkers, and part of this discussion, it seems to me that it's not covering the poor people and the uneducated people, because where I work, most of the people don't have computers, and our school district is trying to put all the teachers online and all the schools online, and we all get websites, and we're supposed to put the homework on, and it's a big waste of time, and the union is fighting it because our parents don't have computers, our kids don't have computers, and they're not going to go to the library and do all this. And if you drive through Yonkers, which is pretty poor areas, they have no problem socializing. Everybody's out in the street in the middle of the day. So when you're talking about this, in my eyes, you're really talking about upper middle class, sort of educated people who have, jobs and careers and aren't really home to keep an eye on the kids, and the kids are fragmented and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. Where I work in Yonkers, the inner city kids, there are people home, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, cousins. They don't need to be on the computer because they're playing outside and they're playing together and they're sitting on a corner and they're hanging out at the laundromat. And they're not going to be affected in that same way.
Well, let's think of it in a couple of terms. First of all, I agree with you that there's going to be a distinction between people who are immersed in mediology and people who are not in any society.
Right.
And the reason that our society is to a certain degree a laboratory for this kind of behavioral change is not because everybody has access to it. It's because more people have more access to it than in any other society. And you could talk about South Korea, you could talk about Finland or whatever to a certain degree. But from the perspective of being a large society, we're it. Now that doesn't mean it's universal. But remember, too, that it's an evolving thing. And also remember that the poor people that you're talking about have access to, for example, to movies. And the movies that they're seeing have digitally rendered images that are impossible. So part of the zeitgeist of what they're growing up with is Jurassic Park and The Matrix and
cell phones.
And cell phones
Right.
and worlds that would have been impossible even to manufacture in a realistic way 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So part of the question here is not so much where are they today, and forget for the moment about computers. Think about mediology as everything, right? It's the immersion of a culture in a variety of devices. Where are they going to be 20 years from now?
They're going
40.
to be underground people.
Well, they may be, but think too about and again.
The digital divide is
Not-
expanding every day.
Yeah, but it's not just a digital divide. It's not just about people who have computers and not. It's also the function of how society feeds media to people who don't otherwise have access to it. There may be people, I forget who brought up the point, there may be people who have control. There may be people who don't have control. There always are in societies. Now the question is, what is the function of control? If you want to follow the Orwellian theme, then you feed mass consumed entertainment to people that you want to keep down because that keeps them distracted. That may be the form of mediology that goes to those people. It may be 20 years from now it's virtual reality. Maybe these people will have no hope in their life. In fact, I think it's a nice speculation to imagine what the outcome is of our moving more to a service economy and fewer people having control of more and more of the infrastructure. Right, people don't have jobs. So what do you give an expanding population that has fewer jobs? You give them distractions, right? You give them food and you give them distractions. So I could make the case that 30 years from now, it will be a societal function to provide distractions to the growing mass of people who are disenfranchised. That would be one speculation. That's not a happy speculation. Yeah.
But that's games and bread. The Romans did that.
Yeah, right. That wouldn't be new.
It seems to me that your mediology can grow, and probably will grow, in relatively wealthy countries. What happens in places like Kazakhstan or in places in Africa where they got nothing to eat, they got nothing. They got droughts to fight.
It's impossible to know. If I were going to be glib, and I will be, I'll do my glib dance. Suppose for the moment that the myth of Gaia is true. That is, that the Earth is a sentient being, and that it adjusts itself to disproportionate changes in its inhabitants. On that basis, we could say that AIDS, monkey virus, that the Earth will reestablish some sort of order based on overpopulation, decimation of the environment, and whatever, and that the people in, what did you say, Kazakhstan, will disappear substantially, or they will become, at one with the dirt, which will be effectively the same thing. On the other hand, you could make a case that society will become increasingly affluent, and we will find a way to feed them, and we'll find a way to gradually bring them up. Now, there'll always be the tail of the dog, at least for the foreseeable future, certainly be well beyond my lifetime. But, there'll be a relatively happy tail of the dog at some point because they'll be fed and they'll start to get streams of stuff, which is basically what we're talking about here as much as anything else, stuff that we accumulate.
But who will feed them? What?
Well, I have no idea, but that has nothing to do with my book. Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for a lucid and a very entertaining presentation. I came here tonight to honor an old college show on the publication of a new book, which I'm looking forward to reading. And also, I'd expected you to lead me into the future about what technology is and what mediology is. Now I fear I have stumbled upon a fellow Luddite, which really makes me happy. Am I right or am I wrong?
No, I said I was a pessimist. I'm an avid user of technology and media, and you scratch a pessimist and you find an idealist, right? I'd hate to think that I'm a Luddite, at least in the sense that I believe you meant the word. I don't think that mediology is good or bad. I think it is the combination of behavior and, I said before, use ahead of understanding. That is, if you want to use the term bad, that would be my conjecture. It's not so much that we can't find ways to make this work, it's that we don't have the time unless we start talking about it, and we're not talking about it.
What was interesting was you touched upon the 2 points in mediology that scare me the most, one being the isolation factor, the other being the loss of privacy. And I have this picture of a 7-year-old kid doing interactive sandbox play, and 10 years later, even though he's never left his room, everyone knows his social security number, what toys he likes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now you have this combination of people staying at home, never leaving their room, and yet everyone knows everything about them.
Yeah, well, it may be so. You know what, I'm going to take whatever other questions you have offline, if you don't mind. I don't want to be rude to people who actually have to get back to places like Connecticut, New Jersey, to their so-called lives. Thank you very much for your attention and your time.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.